April 7, 1943. Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. The morning sun burned through the humid air as the sound of aircraft engines echoed across Henderson Field. Captain James Sweat sat in the cockpit of his F-4F Wildcat fighter, sweat already soaking through his flight suit. His hands gripped the control stick with the same steady confidence he had once used to guide a plow through the fields of his family's farm in San Mateo, California. The radio crackled to life. Japanese bombers were inbound, a massive formation, 70 aircraft strong. They were coming to destroy Henderson Field and everyone on it. Sweat's squadron scrambled. 12 American fighters against 70 enemy planes. The odds were impossible. But in the next 17 minutes, this farmer, son from California, would do something that would be recorded in the official records of the United States Marine Corps as one of the most extraordinary displays of aerial combat in the history of warfare. He would shoot down 7 Japanese dive bombers in a single mission on his very first day of combat. And over the next 44 days, he would destroy 26 enemy aircraft, earning the Medal of Honor and changing the way America understood what one determined pilot could accomplish when everything was on the line. What happened in the skies over Guadalcanal that morning was not just about skill or luck. It was about the values instilled in a young man who grew up working the land, who understood persistence and precision, and who brought those lessons into the cockpit of a fighter plane. Stay with this story, because what you are about to witness is the transformation of an ordinary American into a legend, and the proof that sometimes the most dangerous warriors are those who learn to fight by learning to work. This is the story of James Sweat, a man who grew up feeding cattle and mending fences, a man who had never fired a gun in anger before the spring of 1943, and a man who would become one of the deadliest fighter pilots in the Pacific War. The weapon he carried into battle was not just his aircraft or his guns. It was something deeper, something forged in the fields of California, a work ethic, a refusal to quit, and an understanding that every task, no matter how difficult, could be completed if you focused and followed through. By the end of this story, you will understand how a farmer became an ace, and why the Japanese never saw him coming. James Elm Sweat was born on June 15, 1920, in Seattle, Washington. His family moved to San Mateo, California, when he was a boy. They bought a small farm. The work was hard. The hours were long. From the time he could walk, Sweat worked alongside his father. They planted crops. They tended livestock. They repaired equipment. The farm demanded precision. A fence poorly mended would fail. A crop poorly tended would die. There was no room for half measures. You did the job right or you did it again. These were the lessons Sweat learned before he ever thought about flying. He attended San Mateo Junior College. He was an average student. Not brilliant, but steady. He played sports. He worked part-time jobs. He helped on the farm. And he watched the world change around him. By 1941, war was spreading across Europe and Asia. The Japanese had invaded China. The Germans had conquered France. America was not yet involved, but everyone knew it was only a matter of time. Sweat made a decision. He would join the military. He would become a pilot. The decision was not romantic. Sweat did not dream of glory or adventure. He saw flying as a job. A difficult job that required skill and focus. The same qualities he had developed on the farm. He enlisted in the United States Navy in 1941. He was accepted into flight training. And he discovered that everything he had learned about work translated directly into the cockpit. Flying required precision. It required focus. It required the ability to remain calm under pressure. Sweat excelled. He was not the flashiest pilot in his class. He was not the one performing aerobatic stunts or pushing the boundaries of the aircraft. But he was consistent, reliable, effective. His instructors noticed. They recommended him for fighter training. And by early 1943, he had earned his wings and been assigned to Marine Fighting Squadron 221, based at Guadalcanal. Guadalcanal was hell. The island sat at the southern end of the Solomon Islands chain. The Japanese had built an airfield there in 1942. The Americans had captured it in August of that year after a brutal amphibious landing, But the fighting had not stopped. The Japanese were determined to retake the island. They sent ships. They sent troops. And they sent aircraft. Wave after wave of bombers and fighters launched from bases in Rabaul and Bougainville. Their mission was to destroy Henderson Field and force the Americans to abandon Guadalcanal. The airfield was everything. If it fell, the island fell. And if the island fell, the entire Solomon Islands campaign would collapse. The pilots stationed at Henderson Field lived under constant threat. The Japanese bombed the airfield almost daily. They came at dawn. They came at dusk. They came in massive formations designed to overwhelm the American defenses. The pilots slept in tents near the runway. They ate cold rations. They bathed in rivers. And they flew mission after mission until exhaustion became a permanent condition. The heat was oppressive. The humidity made it hard to breathe. Malaria ravaged the garrison. Dysentery was epidemic. And the sound of air raid sirens became the soundtrack of daily life. Sweat arrived at Guadalcanal on April 1, 1943. He had never been in combat. He had never fired his guns at an enemy plane. He had never experienced the terror of being targeted by Japanese fighters. But he had been trained. And he had the temperament of a farmer who understood that panic solved nothing. You assessed the situation. You made a plan. And you executed it. 7 days after his arrival, he would put that philosophy to the test in a way that no one could have anticipated. The morning of April 7th began like any other. The pilots gathered for breakfast. They checked the flight board. They waited. The waiting was the hardest part. You knew the Japanese were coming. You just did not know when. At 0745 hours, the air raid sirens screamed. Radar had picked up a massive formation approaching from the northwest. 70 aircraft. Bombers escorted by fighters. They were coming for Henderson Field. Every available fighter on the island scrambled. 12 Wildcats and a handful of Army Air Force P-40s took off into the bright morning sky. Sweat was among them. His call sign was Zeke. His aircraft was F4 Bureau number 03849. The engine roared as he climbed to altitude. And then he saw them. The Japanese formation was enormous. Aichi D-3A dive bombers, called VALs by the Americans, flew in tight groups. Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters circled above them, protecting the bombers from attack. The Americans were outnumbered nearly 6-1. Standard doctrine called for coordinated attacks. Wingmen stayed together. Pilots supported each other. But Sweat saw something the others did not. The Japanese formation was stretched out. The bombers were vulnerable. And if he attacked from the right angle, he could hit them before the Zeros could react. He broke formation. He dove. The Wildcats screamed down out of the sun. Sweat lined up on the trailing bomber. His finger closed on the trigger. The .650 caliber machine guns mounted in the wings roared to life. Traces lanced through the air. The bomber shuddered. Smoke poured from its engine. It rolled over and plunged into the sea. Sweat did not celebrate. He pulled up, looked for the next target, and fired again. Another bomber exploded. Then another. He was in the zone. Everything slowed down. His farm-trained hands moved with mechanical precision. Aim, fire, adjust, fire again. The Japanese Zeros realized what was happening. They turned to engage, but Sweat was already moving. He twisted through the sky. He used every trick his instructors had taught him. He exploited the Wildcat's superior dive speed and structural strength. The Zeros were faster and more maneuverable, but they could not catch him. He stayed below them. He stayed fast. And he kept firing. In 17 minutes, Sweat shot down 7 Japanese dive bombers. 7 confirmed kills in his first combat mission. It was a record. The official after-action report filed by VMF-221 documented every kill. Each one was witnessed by other pilots or confirmed by gun camera footage. The report noted Sweat's extraordinary coolness under fire and his aggressive and skillful attack. But the mission ended badly. Sweat's aircraft had taken hits. His fuel tank was punctured. His engine was running rough, and he was out of ammunition. He turned back toward Guadalcanal. But the engine quit before he reached the airfield. He ditched in the ocean just offshore. The impact knocked him unconscious. He came to underwater. The cockpit was flooding. He fought his way free, broke the surface, and swam to shore. A patrol boat picked him up 30 minutes later. He was bruised, exhausted, but alive. And he had just announced himself as one of the most dangerous fighter pilots in the Pacific. The Japanese had not expected this. Their intelligence reports suggested that American pilots were competent but not exceptional. The Japanese Navy's fighter pilots were considered the best in the world. They had trained for years. They had combat experience in China. They flew superior aircraft. The Zero was faster, more maneuverable, and had a longer range than anything the Americans could field. Japanese pilots believed they had a technical and tactical advantage. But they had not accounted for men like Sweat. Men who brought a different kind of strength to the fight. Not just skill, but persistence. Not just training, but character. Sweat's background as a farmer gave him an unusual advantage. He understood machinery. He knew how to coax performance out of failing equipment. He had spent years maintaining tractors and pumps and harvesters. He knew that machines broke down. And he knew how to keep working even when things went wrong. This translated directly into aerial combat. When his aircraft was damaged, he did not panic. He assessed the problem. He adjusted, and he kept flying. When his guns jammed, he cleared them. When his fuel ran low, he calculated the best glide path back to base. These were not skills taught in flight school. They were skills learned in childhood on a farm in California, where quitting was never an option. The symbolic object that defined Sweat's story was not a gun or a plane, it was a wrench. The simple, ubiquitous tool that every farmer keeps in his toolbox. Sweat carried a small, adjustable wrench in the pocket of his flight suit. He had brought it from home. It was the same wrench he had used to repair farm equipment, and he used it in the cockpit to make minor adjustments to his gun sight and control mechanisms. The wrench was a reminder of where he came from, of the values he carried. It was a symbol of American ingenuity. The idea that any problem could be solved if you had the right attitude and the willingness to work. The Japanese flew with samurai swords and ceremonial scrolls. Sweat flew with a wrench. And that difference said everything about the two nations and the war they were fighting. Over the next 44 days, Sweat flew mission after mission. He escorted bombers. He flew combat air patrol over Henderson Field. He intercepted Japanese raids. And he kept shooting down enemy aircraft. His tally climbed steadily. 8 kills. 10 kills. 15 kills. Each victory was recorded in the squadron's official logs. Each one was witnessed and confirmed. By mid-May 1943, Sweat had destroyed 26 enemy aircraft. He had become an ace 5 times over. And he had done it in just 6 weeks of combat. The numbers were staggering. But they only told part of the story. What made Sweat exceptional was not just his kill count, it was his consistency. He flew aggressively but never recklessly. He took calculated risks, but never threw his life away. He shot down Japanese planes because he understood his aircraft, understood his weapons, and understood himself. He knew his limits. He knew when to press and attack and when to disengage. And he knew that survival was just as important as victory. A dead pilot was no good to anyone. His fellow pilots noticed. They saw that Sweat returned from every mission. They saw that he never lost his cool. And they started to emulate his tactics. The lessons he had learned on the farm spread through the squadron. Focus on the fundamentals. Maintain your equipment. Stay calm under pressure. Do the job and come home. These were not flashy principles, but they worked, and they saved lives. The official citation for Sweat's Medal of Honor, awarded in October 1943, described his actions on April 7th in precise detail. It noted that he unhesitatingly hurled himself against a formation of 15 enemy bombers and personally destroyed 7 enemy aircraft. It praised his indomitable fighting spirit and his heroic initiative. But it could not fully capture what Sweat had done. The citation was limited by the language of military bureaucracy. It could record facts. It could describe actions. But it could not convey the deeper truth. That Sweat's heroism was rooted not in some innate warrior spirit, but in the simple, stubborn determination of a man who had learned to work. The Japanese losses over Guadalcanal in the spring of 1943 were catastrophic. They lost hundreds of aircraft. They lost experienced pilots who could not be replaced. The Imperial Japanese Navy had started the war with the best trained naval aviators in the world. But by mid-1943, those men were dead or exhausted. The replacements were younger, less experienced, less capable. And the Americans were getting better. Pilots like Sweat were not just shooting down enemy planes. They were destroying the foundation of Japanese air power. Every pilot killed was a pilot who could not train the next generation. Every aircraft destroyed was an aircraft that could not be replaced. The industrial capacity of the two nations was tilting the balance. But it was the skill and determination of individual pilots that made the difference in the short term. Sweat's success was not accidental. It was the product of American training, American technology, and American character. The F-4F Wildcat was not the best fighter in the world. It was slower than the Zero. It was less maneuverable. But it was tough. It could absorb damage and keep flying. It had armor plating to protect the pilot. It had self-sealing fuel tanks. And it had 6 heavy machine guns that could shred an enemy aircraft in seconds. The Wildcat was designed for survival. It was the fighter equivalent of American pragmatism. Not elegant, but effective. Not flashy, but reliable. And in the hands of a pilot like Sweat, it was deadly. But the real advantage was not the machine. It was the man. Sweat brought to the cockpit everything he had learned in his first 22 years of life. The discipline of farm work. The patience of a man who had waited for crops to grow and animals to mature. The understanding that success was the product of consistent effort over time. These were not military virtues. They were civilian virtues. But they translated into military effectiveness in ways that no amount of tactical training could replicate. The Japanese trained their pilots to be warriors. The Americans trained their pilots to be professionals. And in a long war, professionalism beat warriorism every time. Sweat rotated out of Guadalcanal in May 1943. He had flown more than 50 combat missions. He was exhausted. He had lost weight. He had contracted malaria. But he was alive. And he had proven that an ordinary American could do extraordinary things. He returned to the United States for a brief leave. He visited his family in California. He walked the fields of the farm where he had grown up. And he realized that the war had changed him. He was no longer the young man who had left San Mateo in 1941. He had seen death. He had killed. He had watched friends die. And he carried those experiences with him. But he also carried the knowledge that he had made a difference, that his actions had saved lives. That every Japanese bomber he shot down was a bomber that did not drop its payload on American troops. That every Zero he destroyed was a Zero that did not strafe Henderson Field. The mathematics of war were brutal. But they were also simple, and Sweat understood them. He was awarded the Medal of Honor in a ceremony at the White House. President Franklin D. Roosevelt personally draped the medal around his neck. The citation was read aloud. The cameras flashed. And Sweat stood at attention, uncomfortable in his dress uniform, wishing he was anywhere else. He did not feel like a hero. He felt like a man who had done his job. And to him, that was all that mattered. But the American public needed heroes. They needed to believe that their sons and brothers and husbands were fighting with skill and courage. They needed stories of victory to offset the grim casualty reports from the Pacific Islands and the European continent. And Sweat became one of those stories. His face appeared in newspapers. His name was mentioned in radio broadcasts, and for a brief moment he was famous. He hated it. He was not built for publicity. He was built for work. And as soon as the ceremony was over, he requested reassignment to a combat squadron. He went back to the Pacific. He flew more missions. He shot down more enemy aircraft. And by the time the war ended in 1945, his total kill count had risen to well over 30 confirmed victories, making him one of the top American aces of World War II. After the war, Sweat returned to civilian life. He did not return to farming. The war had shown him a different path. He joined a business. He raised a family. He lived quietly. He rarely spoke about his combat experiences. When asked, he deflected. He talked about his squadron. about the mechanics who kept the planes flying, about the radar operators who spotted the enemy formations, about everyone except himself. This humility was characteristic of his generation. They had done what was necessary, and then they moved on. But the legacy of what Sweat accomplished endures. It endures in the official records of the Marine Corps. It endures in the histories of the Pacific War, and it endures in the broader story of American exceptionalism. Not the false exceptionalism of superiority or destiny, but the real exceptionalism of ordinary people doing extraordinary things when circumstances demand it. Sweat was not a superhuman warrior. He was a farmer's son who learned to fly. And that was enough. The wrench he carried in his flight suit was eventually donated to a museum. It sits in a display case now, alongside his Medal of Honor and a photograph of him standing next to his Wildcat. Visitors walk past it every day. Most do not notice. It is just a wrench, an old worn tool. But to those who know the story, it is more. It is a symbol of the American spirit. The belief that any problem can be solved, that any challenge can be met. That skill and determination and hard work are more valuable than any advantage of birth or circumstance. The Japanese pilots who fought against Sweat in the spring of 1943 recorded their experiences in diaries and after-action reports. Some of those documents survived the war. They describe the American pilots as aggressive and fearless. They note the increasing skill of the American fighters, and they express frustration at their inability to protect the bomber formations. One Japanese pilot wrote in his diary after the April 7th mission that the Americans fight like demons. He did not know that the pilot who had destroyed 7 of his comrades that day had grown up on a farm. That he had learned to shoot by hunting rabbits in the California hills. That he carried a wrench in his pocket, but it would not have mattered. The result was the same. The Japanese were losing, and men like Sweat were the reason why. The transformation that occurred in James Sweat between April and May of 1943 was not a transformation of character. His character had been formed long before he ever climbed into a cockpit. It was a transformation of circumstance. He went from being an unknown replacement pilot to being one of the most celebrated aces in the Pacific. But inside he remained the same. He remained the man who understood that work was its own reward. That doing the job well was more important than recognition. That success was measured not in medals or headlines, but in lives saved and missions completed. This philosophy was inherently American. It was the philosophy of the frontier, of the farmer and the craftsman and the builder. It was the belief that value was created through effort, that respect was earned through competence, that no task was beneath you if it needed to be done. The Japanese had a different philosophy. They valued honor and sacrifice. They believed in the nobility of death in service to the emperor. And that philosophy led them to make decisions that cost them the war. They spent their best pilots in suicide attacks. They refused to retreat, even when retreat was the only rational choice. They believed that spirit could overcome material disadvantage. And they were wrong. The Americans believed in material advantage. They built more planes. They trained more pilots. They developed better tactics. And they won. But the material advantage was only part of the equation. The other part was men like Sweat, men who brought to the fight not just training and equipment, but a set of values that made them formidable in ways the enemy could not anticipate. The Japanese could build better planes. They could train their pilots longer, but they could not replicate the culture that produced a James Sweat. They could not create an agricultural tradition that taught young men patience and precision. They could not duplicate the American belief in individualism and self-reliance, and that is why they lost. The 26 Japanese aircraft that Sweat destroyed in 44 days represented more than just numbers. Each one was a machine that had been built by Japanese workers, that had been flown by a Japanese pilot, that had been sent into combat with a specific mission, and each one that was destroyed represented a failure of the Japanese war effort. A failure to protect their bombers, a failure to establish air superiority, a failure to stop the American advance. The cumulative effect of those failures was the collapse of Japanese air power in the Solomons. And the collapse of Japanese air power led to the collapse of Japanese control over the island chain. And that collapse opened the path for the American advance toward the Philippines and eventually toward Japan itself. Sweat's contribution to that advance cannot be measured solely by his kill count. It must be measured by the effect his actions had on the broader strategic picture. Every bomber he shot down was a bomber that did not attack American positions. Every Zero he destroyed was a Zero that did not strafe American troops. And every mission he flew successfully was a mission that convinced other American pilots that they could win. Morale matters in war. And the success of pilots like Sweat boosted American morale while sapping Japanese confidence. The final poetic truth of Sweat's story is this: wars are not won by the strongest or the fastest or the most technologically advanced. Wars are won by those who refuse to quit, by those who keep working when everyone else has given up, by those who understand that victory is the product of 1,000 small efforts, each performed with care and precision. James Sweat understood this. He had learned it on a farm in California, and he carried that lesson into the skies over Guadalcanal. The wrench in his pocket was a reminder, not of where he had been, but of what he believed, that any job worth doing was worth doing right. That skill and effort mattered more than talent or luck, and that an ordinary American armed with determination and a good machine could take on the best the enemy had to offer and win. If you want to hear more incredible stories of American heroes and untold moments from World War II, make sure to subscribe and stay tuned. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.